Good afternoon, New York. Good morning, Los Angeles, and all those in between. I'm Dmitry Glinsky. I'm glad to welcome you on behalf of our American Russian-Speaking Association and the Russian-Speaking Community Council. Today, we have convened for another roundtable of our Ukrainian and Russian diaspora anti-war dialogue that has been going on since 2014, since the first Kremlin invasion in Ukraine. Over the past couple of years, we have convened with immigration attorneys to discuss such issues as the Ukrainian parole U4U, and then when we produced a handbook in Russian for asylum seekers that was published a year ago and of course will be soon outdated. Today we're again having a conversation with distinguished attorneys on the eve of the International Migrants Day that will be 2 days from now on December 18. So we will be discussing today, of course, the situation with our immigrant community, but also go beyond that and talk about the broader threats to human and civil rights that might affect also US citizens, immigrant and non-immigrant in the foreseeable future. I will introduce our distinguished leaders of the legal profession who we have here today a little later. For now, let me give an overview of the situation. Over the past 4 years, the Biden administration has done a lot of things that have affected positively immigrant communities from former Soviet countries. It has rebuilt the refugee resettlement system, has created a legal path for claiming asylum through CBP-1, and came up with very creative solutions to humanitarian emergencies, including U4U parole for Ukrainians that was replicated in for a few other countries as well. And this was all hugely important for people from countries like Ukraine and Russia that have lived through terrific destruction not seen since World War II. So let me give a few numbers so that we have an idea of the constituency we are talking about today. Ukrainians with parole, humanitarian parole in the States, there have been over 214,000 recipients of U4U humanitarian parole, which actually is more than half of the entire Ukrainian-born population, according to American Community Survey, the annual mini census. So the number of Ukrainians in the country has in fact doubled in the past couple of years. More than 26,000 are under temporary protected status, those that were in the country at the time when the war started. There are Ukrainian students under special student relief. The number is estimated at over 2,400 people. Then going to Russian asylum seekers that we'll also be discussing today. The number of immigration court cases filed for the removal of Russian newcomers on non-criminal charges on the notice to appear is over 73,000 in the past 3 years. And if we add the numbers from the Executive Office of Immigration Review on Russian language used in the courtroom, it comes up to 81,000 for the past 3 years. Asylum grants, affirmative and defensive altogether, over the past 3 years, Russian citizens have received over 6,700 asylum grants. The rate of positive decisions in the courts is pretty high for refugees from former Soviet countries. It's 86% for Russians, 88% for Belarusians, 90% for Azerbaijan, the 3 most severe repressive regimes. So these decisions, in a sense, reflect the judge's accurate assessment of the underlying realities of persecution in those countries. But when you look at specific states, the picture is very different. For example, in Louisiana, out of about 500 Russian cases decided by the court in this fiscal year, only half were approved and half were denied. And we know that in Louisiana, there are quite a few Russians in ICE detention centers, such as Wynn, and they have to go through court hearings there, very hard to get an attorney. And even those who win asylum, we recently hear that they get the Department of Homeland Security appeal the positive decision on the 30th day. And as a result, they are kept in detention for months more, which causes outrage among families. And even we heard of hunger strikes there. According to ICE reporting, there have been about 2,500 Russians detained in this fiscal year, almost all of them by CBP, and more than 90% of them on non-criminal charges. A complicated situation because we know that some people from Russia do come with no real basis for asylum, and even some who might be government agents are slipping through the cracks into the country, and even boasting about this on YouTube. We heard about this, and yet people who come with their families and little children seeking refuge are kept in detention, and immigration authorities often don't have enough country expertise to distinguish the former from the latter. So one of my questions today for everyone will be, how can we draw more attention, including more media and government attention, maybe legal profession attention to this detention crisis? There have been also some family separations. And for example, last Friday, an article online was also cited one of our organization's board member, New York attorney Elena Dinevich, mentioned that there have been in total about 80 children separated from their asylum-seeking families over the past year. And out of them, some 50 were Russian. And out of these 50, all but one were separated on grounds of national security, which the government is not required to explain. There have been a couple of lawsuits recently by Russian asylum seekers in detention, suing federal government over prolonged stays there. And thanks to these lawsuits, a few dozen people have been thankfully released in the past couple of months. Beside these large groups that I mentioned, we of course have, as any other community, other immigrants that are vulnerable in this situation. We have DACA recipients, deferred action for childhood arrivals, the permission to stay for those who were secretly brought into the US as children. Even though there are only 400 of them for entire former Soviet countries, it's still, these are people that we care about. And there, of course, are undocumented, it's mostly visa overstays. Likely they're in the thousands. We don't know the numbers, but many of us have met them. And I think we should not ignore anyone. Also, let us keep in mind that people who are deported to countries such as Russia or China or Venezuela, unlike people who are deported to democratic countries, they are delivered straight into the hands of repressive regimes and likely persecution. Over the last fiscal year, there have been about 300 Russians that were deported from the United States, and only about 15 of them, that's according to ICE data, had criminal charges. So the new president-elect, Donald Trump, has not moved into the White House yet, but in one important way, I would submit he is already in charge, because many of those who voted against him seem to be controlled a little bit through fear and panic caused by the election results, and we observe this. And he has already promised, I would say, to, or at least from the statements you can sense, that there is a possibility of violation of some human rights, even of US citizens. That just as from what we heard from the election campaign. Specifically on immigration, we heard that the new administration, and again, these were election statements, so we don't know what will actually happen, but what was said is that he wants to eliminate CBP-1 appointments, he wants to shut down temporary protected status, which he tried to do in the first term, but ACLU stopped him through the courts. He would like to restrict parole, which he believes has been abused. There have been some leaks about executive orders that will make detention of asylum seekers mandatory, will restrict asylum by excluding social group from the list of grounds for asylum. Would that affect, for example, LGBTQ asylum seekers? So there are many questions. Project 2025, which many consider to be a blueprint of his policies, also calls for tightening criteria for credible fear interviews. To what extent it will be implemented depends, of course, on many institutions, and I think the whole of society, from court judges to all those of us legally in the country, at the very least voicing our opinion, and of course will depend on our lawyers and our access to them, which is often an issue. By our count, out of 1,600 AILA, American Immigration Law Association lawyers, listings of those who work on asylum and protection, out of all these numbers, there are only 65 that identify as Russian-speaking, which means more than 1,100 Russian-speaking cases per lawyer. And Ukrainian-speaking, just 16. In practice, we know that these are often even not lawyers, but the staff that was there at the time that the listing was posted. So there is a big issue of access to legal services. And we do experience that the fact that many non-Russian speaking offices are very wary of working with asylum seekers from Russia and other former Soviet countries. And this is unfortunately a fact that we have seen. Russian-speaking lawyers very rarely are found. We haven't found any of them working for large, big capacity firms dealing with asylum. So we are particularly grateful to our speakers today that they have joined us. We hope that will be our breakthrough into the wider circle of attorneys working on immigrant rights and human rights, and that will carry a message that we are not some kind of group that somehow is supposed to be treated differently than others. One by one, I will introduce the speaker, and then they will give their introduction, and then I will introduce the next one. Sabrina Damast leads an immigration law office in Los Angeles, and before opening her own law practice, Sabrina served as a judicial law clerk in the Los Angeles Immigration Court, and she wrote more than 200 decisions for dozens of immigration judges. So she is an expert in all forms of deportation defense, including defensive asylum applications, and has represented clients in deportation proceedings. She frequently gives presentations, publishes articles, and videos with updates on immigration policies that I very much encourage you to watch on her firm's Facebook page. Her work has earned her several awards from the American Immigration Law Association and Public Council Immigrants' Rights Project.
I'm going to give you just some brief thoughts on some of the obstacles I think that Russians and Ukrainians in particular are likely to be facing in the new Trump administration. From my perspective as an attorney who works in the immigration court system, who does asylum representation, and who has represented people in detention, all of which are topics that I know Dmitry touched on in his introduction to everyone. So I'm going to start with the parole programs, the U4U program in particular for Ukrainians. I would probably take a bet in Vegas that U4U's U4U's days are numbered. I do not think that the incoming administration is likely to continue the program. That's the same for many other similar parole programs that the Biden administration has put in place for people from various Latin American countries and such. But since we're focusing today on primarily the Ukrainian and Russian communities in the US, we'll stick with U4U. I just don't think it's going to continue. I don't think more people are going to come in. I don't think people who are here on parole are going to be able to extend that parole. I mean, parole is definitely parole in a very large sense, but U4U as a subset of that is definitely something I think has a target on it, which means that folks who are here in parole, and that may include, by the way, folks that Russians and or Ukrainians that presented at a port of entry and were paroled in by CBP pending filing of an application for asylum or other removal proceedings. But anybody who has parole status, I think, should be thinking about what are their next steps, right? Because those, I don't think extensions are coming. And that means, if the person is Ukrainian, they might be eligible for TPS. They might be thinking about TPS, although footnote that because I'm about to give my dismal news on what I think is going to happen to TPS too. It means if the person may have an asylum claim, they should be filing that as soon as possible, whether that's defensively in the immigration court system, if they're in that process, or affirmatively with their assigned asylum office if they're not in the immigration court process. So that's my first thing. My second thing, since I already touched on it, I'll go to TPS. I think TPS's days are equally numbered for Ukrainians and many, many other nationalities as well. We saw this during the first Trump administration, that they tried to cancel TPS for just about every country that had it. Not quite all of them, but all of the ones that President Trump had high opinions of the conditions of that country, aka what he liked to refer to as the shithole countries. I think we're not going to see a better attitude this time around towards TPS. And despite the fact that clearly conditions have not materially changed in Ukraine since the designation was made, I just don't think that President Trump is going to extend it any further. I think he's going to see it as part of a restrictionist immigration policy to end it, to move as many people out who have been here on U4U or TPS and sort of say, it's not our problem, you go figure it out. So again, that comes back to the question, what other options do people with TPS have? Could be an asylum claim. One of the things, and I will let my colleagues who do more employment-based immigration touch on this, but I know we had a question submitted about the ability to apply for employment-based permanent residency when you're here in parole status. I have known just enough to be dangerous, and then my colleagues can take it from here. I think people in parole status lack a fundamental requirement for adjusting status in employment-based categories, which is to be in a non-immigrant status at the time of the adjustment, but people in temporary protected status don't have that problem, which means that I think folks in temporary protected status may have options. You guys can tell me if I'm wrong about that, but I remember hearing that in a presentation somewhere. My colleagues are much better versed than I am in employment-based adjustment because I don't practice in that area, but sometimes like to sit in on the CLEs and learn new things. So then I think the next real topic of interest for folks is detention policies. And I do think we've already seen a shift in this before the election. I personally just consulted maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago, maybe not even, with a Russian national who had been paroled in. He'd been detained at the port of entry, but after going through a series of security screenings for about 60 days, was then paroled by ICE out of detention, had filed an asylum application, was awaiting a non-detained calendar master hearing in like New Jersey somewhere, and then residing here in California. And then all of a sudden one day gets a call from local ICE to come present in person on his check-in schedule, and they detained him. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that, particularly probably for Russian citizens. And I think the major problem here, and this is a no-win scenario right now, given the current bans on asylum for people who don't enter, through a lawful, either a paroled or get a CBP-1 appointment, which results in parole, but basically who try to enter between ports of entry. Everyone who presents at a port of entry, and many others as well, but including everyone at a port of entry, are deemed what we call arriving aliens under the immigration laws. In many ways, that's very unimportant in terms of eligibility for asylum versus not eligibility. Arriving aliens, non-arriving aliens, they can apply for asylum. The problem is that arriving aliens, if they're detained by ICE, have no ability to seek a bond from an immigration judge. They can request a bond hearing. They can be the cleanest person, no criminal history anywhere in the world. Maybe they showed up, as we were discussing, with a family and they were separated from their family at the port of entry. But they are not eligible, which means they're at the mercy of ICE. Since they're not eligible for bond from a judge, they're at the mercy of whether or not ICE will parole them out of detention. So I think if you go back to my fact pattern I gave an example of a person who ICE did parole at the outset or close to the outset, but then some years later called him in for whatever reason and then detained him. Clearly, at that stage, ICE has decided they want this person in custody and they have no intention of paroling them. And once an arriving alien, you're still an arriving alien 1 year, 2 years later. It doesn't matter that you were out in the non-detained world, living your life, working your job. And I think that really presents a unique set of challenges that people need to prepare for. And this is not exclusive to people that have this arriving alien designation, which also applies to anybody who entered on parole, just to be clear, but really in general, anybody who's not here with, as of yet, approved immigration status, who's subject to being detained. Detention is awful. I know that sounds completely ridiculously obvious, but as Dimitri was touching on, there's a ton of detention centers in, quite frankly, the middle of nowhere, Louisiana. There's no way to effectively access them as an attorney. Maybe if you're lucky, there's some sort of iPad system where you can schedule private attorney video calls, maybe not. The immigration world has been a bit, has tried, but isn't super consistent on getting its technology in order. But in terms of in-person meetings, like that's just not going to happen for most of those places. They're too far away from any place in which you're going to find qualified counsel. But even if you find qualified counsel and you're in a detention center where they do have good technology, You have all of the challenges of not accessing your personal documents, of not accessing your bank account to pay for the attorney, right? You may have had, particularly if you were released at the outset, but have now been detained later on, you may have had a whole stack of documents you've been working on putting together to support your asylum claim. It could be sitting in a very safe place in your home, the home that you can't get to any longer. Possibly you hired an attorney to represent you in an affirmative asylum or a non-detained asylum. And then when you get detained in Louisiana, that attorney says, I'm sorry, I don't do detained representation. And you're not under our contract entitled to a refund, or only maybe a partial refund, because I did do work in preparing your non-detained asylum case, work that may or may not be all that accessible and beneficial to you while you're sitting in detention, right? So, I mean, always to say this is sort of non-legal but practical advice. I think folks need to plan, if they were detained, who has access to their bank accounts, right? Is there somebody else on the account, or somebody with a power of attorney who could get access to their bank accounts and pay for an attorney? Who knows where those important documents are in the house? If they're in a locked place, do they have a key, or do they know where the key is hidden in your house? I hate to sound the paranoia bells, but I do think that we're going to see an increased number of people being detained, both at the port of entry and after having been in the country for some period of time. And those folks need to have that level of contingency planning in place, or they're going to find themselves kind of up the creek without a paddle in terms of being able to proceed with their asylum claims while in detention.
And I want to now turn to David Ware, whom we are very grateful to have with us. He has been an immigration practitioner since 1982 with a consistent academic focus. David's national practice boasts offices in New Orleans and Denver. He is active in several institutions, including NAFSA, Association of International Educators, the Federal Bar Association, and the National Association of College and University Attorneys, as well as, of course, American Immigration Law Association. He is a frequent speaker and author on immigration topics, and he currently serves on the annual conference committee of the Federal Bars Association Immigration Law Section. David was awarded its Lawyers of the Year in 2017 and the Barry Frager Award this year. Mr. Ware served for 3 years on AILA, American Immigration Law Association, Department of Labor Liaison Committee, as well as on healthcare and student committees.
And thanks for convening this roundtable. This is great, really great to get everyone's questions, get those out of the way, get your doubts resolved, because there is so much, as Sabrina knows, there is so much misinformation on the internet and shady lawyers putting out things that they really don't understand. So my practice focuses on employment-based immigration, and I'm going to give kind of a counterpoint to Sabrina's presentation, what you can do on the permanent resident side and the non-immigrant visa side. First up, let's get that question out of the way about parole. No, you can't adjust status from U4U or parole status because the law requires you to be in a valid non-immigrant status to do that. So what U4U folks should do immediately, if they haven't already started the process, if of course they entered by the redesignation date of TPS, which is April 19th, 2023, they entered by that date, they need to move into TPS status. They can get green cards from TPS status, assuming an appropriate employment-based process has been handled for them. And I had a specific question, I think, from Victoria. I don't know if that was you, Victoria Feforova, or someone else, but the question was, can I adjust status? I'm U4U. Can I adjust status based on an EB1 petition? EB1 is either outstanding professor or researcher at an institution of higher ed, or someone who's of extraordinary ability. And the answer, of course, sadly, as I just stated, is no. But there are a huge panoply of non-immigrant options, temporary visa options for you, assuming you're sponsored by an employer, or green card options for you being sponsored by an employer that you really should move to explore quickly. Although, of course, January 20th, between now and January 20th, there's just a little bit over a month. So there's really no time to get most non-immigrant visa applications approved within that time. And there's really certainly no time to get most green card applications approved or petitions approved in that time. What we expect with the Trump administration is both on the non-immigrant side, the temporary visa side, and the green card side. What we saw in his earlier administration was a tightening of particularly permanent residence cases, extraordinary ability, outstanding professor, researcher, national interest waiver, any of the types of petitions that require or allow for discretion. We saw a huge tightening of discretion and a narrowing of the types of cases that would be approved. During the Biden administration, thankfully, we've seen a huge variety of national interest waiver cases approved. Those are cases where you're in the U.S., you're engaged in an activity that's strongly in the national interest, and you have at least a master's degree or you're of exceptional ability. During Biden, we've seen, particularly with regard to his STEM guidance on national interest waivers, we have seen many, many, many cases, and the approval rate, I think, is up in the 80s, in the high 80% range. But with Trump, that's probably going to go down. Those percentages also with regard to extraordinary ability and outstanding professor researcher, those are probably going to go way down to maybe 50% or less. And so we're going to see a real tightening. Officials are going to be, have a basic niet attitude. Niet comes first, and maybe yes later on, or da down the road somewhere. But it's going to be a real niet attitude, which we saw earlier in his prior administration, 2016 to 2020. And those are basically the points I wanted to address. Dimitri, you have other things you need me to cover before I move on or allow you to move on to Scott? I think there was one other question you sent me from another individual. What was it?
Let me find it. But I think you addressed some of these. They were all from Victoria. So far. Yeah.
What was her second question? She had, I forget what it was.
Let me pull it from the email and post it here.
And those of you considering, if anyone on this call is an F1 student, if you're considering whether to apply for what we call special student relief, which allows you to reduce your course load and get full-time work authorization, or TPS, definitely go for TPS. TPS gives you, it's kind of, I had an old British property professor in law school who used to say, do you want one stick or the whole bundle of sticks? One stick was a leasehold, and the whole bundle of sticks was a freehold to have the whole property ownership. So that's kind of the way I think of TPS versus SSR. And also in another context, in the J1 visa context, if we have anyone here who's a J1 visa holder, the persecution waiver is one stick, and asylum is the whole bundle of sticks, which gives you the pathway to a green card. So between those two options, between SSR and TPS, go for TPS always. And between a persecution waiver or asylum, I can't say always do it, because there's certain little factors, as Sabrina knows, that might make a difference there. But typically, you want to go for asylum if you can, because you get a pathway to permanent residence through asylum. Now, Ukrainians, Dimitri and I were discussing before we came on the call, whether Ukrainians would qualify for asylum or perhaps a persecution waiver if they're here on a J visa. It would be difficult. You might see some Ukrainian nationals who had cooperated with Russia in the occupied territories, Crimea and the East. But I don't think those folks would get a sympathetic hearing in either our asylum system or, or with regard to a persecution waiver. I just don't, because obviously we are completely at odds with Russia now regarding their occupation of Ukraine. Now, going forward, who knows? Who knows what Trump is going to do? Because Putin is his big pal. And he's gonna create peace in Ukraine in 24 hours. So we'll see what happens with Trump. But right now, I would say any Ukrainian applying for asylum in the U.S. is probably going to get a cold shoulder from the government?
I'm going to be a tiny bit more optimistic. I think there is a somewhat broader area for asylum to be explored for Ukrainians, particularly Ukrainians that are Russian primarily speaking individuals, whether or not they actually cooperated with Russia or not. But we can have that conversation, the three of us, another day. But I would say, like, don't give up hope just because you're Ukrainian that you might qualify for asylum, right? Go talk to an attorney, get your individual circumstances evaluated. That'll be my 2 cents on that point.
Absolutely. Everyone considering asylum, please, I had a call a couple of weeks ago with a few Ukrainians, and I was really, really shocked that several of them had applied for asylum without the advice of an attorney or without the assistance of an attorney. That's really a bad idea. Our asylum system is complicated. Anything you say in an affirmative application for asylum can come back to haunt you down the line if you go into removal proceedings, if your asylum is referred to an immigration judge. So I would say get good advice from an immigration lawyer on asylum and allow an immigration lawyer to assist you with your asylum application. I don't know if Sabrina would have a different counterpoint on that, but that would be my very.
Okay.
No, I agree 100%. If you can get a lawyer before you even file, do it. And if you have to file pro se because of financial reasons, save quick and get an attorney to assist you in supplementing or amending as soon as possible. I think that's.
Yeah, our system is very unforgiving for what we call frivolous asylum applications. So if you try to puff up your qualifications or misstate any facts at all in your application, you could be doomed down the road for ever getting a grant of asylum.
We are very fortunate to have here Scott Horton because was my sense and our team's sense when preparing this roundtable that the issues we discuss go beyond immigration law and to the core of human rights system in the United States, at least in part because one of the things that we heard from President-elect is from his advisors is that there might be some new ideological screening for immigrants. As it was stated to bar dangerous lunatics, haters, etc., etc. Well, who would be those people? And more generally, there are issues that go beyond immigration laws. So I'm very happy to have with us Scott Horton. He is an attorney focused on human rights law. In the 1970s and 80s, Scott did legal and human rights work for and on behalf of Andrei Sakharov and his family. And he is the general counsel of the Andrei Sakharov Foundation, which is a big friend organization. Scott later served as president of the International League of Human Rights. In 2003, as chair of the International Human Rights Committee of the New York City Bar Association. Scott became one of the co-authors of the report on the torture of detainees during interrogations by American military in the course of the so-called War on Terror. Scott has been an honorary vice president of the American branch of the International Law Association, a lecturer at Columbia Law School, contributing editor to the Harper's Magazine, and a co-founder and trustee of the American University of Central Asia in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, which brings to my mind one question that we didn't address, and that's, will the Muslim ban be reinstated? The only post-Soviet country that I believe was included in Trump's Muslim ban under the first term was Kyrgyzstan.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I want now to do a softer focus, to pull back to some extent and look at the whole picture from 30,000 feet, shall we say. And I want to start by talking about the history of Russian migration waves, because this is something that, as I have found, is quite influential in the thinking of policymakers, particularly in the United States, but also the UK, Germany, France, and other countries. And I think we start with a recognition that Russian immigration waves have been different in some fundamental ways from most other migration waves that have struck major Western democracies. So we have 3.5 waves that have occurred in recent history. The first one was from 1880 to the outset of World War I, and that involved roughly 2 million Russian citizens. They were, a large part of them were intelligentsia, artists, writers, as well as a very large number of Jews from the Pale of Settlement. So, of course, this would be from present-day Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, but it would be maintained on all the records at the time as just Russia. The second wave then occurred between 1918 and 1928, and that was about 1.5 million people. That prominently included, again, a lot of artists, musicians, aristocrats, industrialists, small business people. The third wave is probably what's going on right now, but we have in between sort of a half wave, which is what occurred at the time of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, that's responsible for immigration of several 100,000 people, largely Jewish migrants. The third wave now commences with the Russian military operations in Ukraine from February 1922 and is continuing today. We probably have about 900,000 people in this wave. So the rate of outflow is consistent with the strongest tides that occurred at any point in the past. And again, when we look at the migrants who are coming, it's very heavily populated with elites. So this is large numbers of scientists, literary, cultural figures, businessmen. It's very heavily male and very, very young. These migration waves all of them have been extraordinarily successful waves. That is, the people who've come in have integrated very quickly into the societies in which they've settled, and many of them have reached positions of high public attainment in many different areas. So I think this influences the way policymakers look at it. Certainly, it's influenced the way people like Jamie Rubin, who the public diplomacy assistant secretary in the Biden administration, viewed it, and has led to an attitude which was very receptive, very positive about this immigration. I think that's helped up to this point. And one of the major questions is, what happens when we get a new administration that doesn't share this positive analysis based in large measure on prior immigration waves from Russia. But I think there are other major consequences for what's going on right now that have an effect on the new American-Russian relationship that will be formed. So I think we have a number of factors which are influencing the relationship between Russia and the West, the relationship between Russia and the U.S., and the prospects for a resolution, even if it's only a temporary resolution of the conflict in Ukraine. And maybe the first of these is connected with this immigration wave. And that's just pure demographics. So if we look at the situation in Russia today, 800,000, 900,000 largely young men who've left the country. And then we have 800,000 roughly young men who have disappeared as a result of the conflict in Ukraine. This is a huge demographic problem for Russia right now, and a problem that's going to have long-term consequences, economic and social consequences, just as wars have in most countries that live through them. And of course, Russia now is seeing rates of casualties, as is Ukraine, that are unlike anything any other European countries have seen since World War II. So that's an exceptional fact. And then we add to this a number of other things. So one of them certainly is the economy. So the Russian economy is showing signs now of some extreme stress. We see this with shock waves that go through currency exchange rates, suspension in trading, collapse in value of major stocks like Gazprom that has occurred recently, or even like today, the news circulating concerning the discussion of the issuance of ration cards and the State Duma. And this economic stress can be traced, I guess, at some level to sanctions coming from the West, but I think more acutely, it's probably really the transformation of the Russian economy to a war economy, which is limiting and not really sustainable in the long term. And second, we have also dramatic and maybe less anticipated. We have developments that have occurred suddenly in the Middle East in the last couple of weeks with the collapse of the Assad regime, a very, very important client state for Russia. And that's exposed some key military assets like the bases in Latakia and Tartus, which were really central staging points for Russian military operations, not just in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, but also in Africa and other places. So this is really has huge impact, logistical and strategic for Russian operations going forward, not just military operations, but also the system of military alliances that have sustained Russia. So what exactly is the state of U.S.-Russian relations right now? And I tried to track this by looking at the characterization of these relations in popular media and political discourse. And it's a process that will lead you to be schizophrenic, frankly, because you see such extreme portrayals on both sides. For instance, just tracking one Russian television program recently, we're told within a period of about 72 hours that relations between the US and Russia are the worst they have ever been, that things are inching towards World War III. There are allusions to the use of new weapon systems and nuclear weapons and so forth. And then on the same program, a day later, suddenly we're told that no, the prospects actually are very, very positive and friendly for our US and Russian relations. And there are discussions of the election of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, the appointment of Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., Kash Patel, and a list of other people who are viewed as friends or potentially friends of Russia, having a totally different attitude towards Russian-US relations, people we can work with, and are viewed as promises for a much better future. So, these rather wild gyrations and characterization suggest that that the analysts are not really very serious, that they are rather more propagandistic than serious. But indeed, it shows that things could break now in a radically different way, but it's not completely clear they do. So the major question, I think, hovering over everything now is Donald Trump's promise, which he repeated during the campaign over and over again, that he would end the war in Ukraine within the first day of his presidency. Of course, we can just count that out. It's not going to happen in the first day of his presidency, but that he will resolve it immediately. Now, he never really explained exactly how he would resolve it, but we had a few statements made by J.D. Vance, and then more recently by the man he's appointed as his special representative for negotiating a conclusion to the war. That's Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, who is, I think, a very serious person, was the national security advisor to Mike Pence during the first Trump administration. They've both given some clues or some signals about how this resolution would come about. It seems relatively clear that the Trump position is going to be to buy peace by having Ukraine concede territory to Russia, most likely all the territory that Russia now occupies, possibly a bit more than just the territory that they now occupy. But of course, there's still large questions about how you would guarantee such a peace if it were negotiated. NATO and EU membership for Ukraine going forward, which is a non-starter as the issue is introduced by Russia, but seems to be critical in the minds of Ukrainians for a resolution. And of course, we have to keep in mind, and what I would say, hovering over all of this is what I call the dynamics of appeasement politics. So, giving the Kremlin what it wants in terms of territory right now, it's unclear that can just lead to an immediate negotiation. Appeasement, if we look at this process historically, it's very unusual that it leads to the end of an aggressor's appetite for conquest. Rather, it has more often the opposite consequence. It leads the aggressor power to seek much more. So, the dynamics of the negotiation are certainly not made easier by a concession in the first step of the major demands of the other power. But I would say this is the major question that hangs over the relationship, and that is likely to have some considerable influence on attitudes about immigration, as well as foreign assistance to the region, rebuilding in Ukraine, and so forth. So I think it's entirely possible that Trump may broker a peace, may do so in terms that are quite favorable to Russia and barely palatable to Ukraine. But of course, it's not just a negotiation that would occur between Trump and Putin. It also involves the Ukrainians, and it also involves the Europeans, who have made an even larger commitment to this war effort than the United States had. Contrary to what one routinely hears both in Russian propaganda and in political discourse in the United States, it's been more of a European-funded and supported military effort that has been one from the U.S. So their stake is also quite considerable. I think, viewing all of this, I'd say the Financial Times analyst Ed Luce is probably right when he says no one knows how this is going to proceed, and least of all, Trump knows how he's going to proceed to deal with this. So I think that this is a huge question hanging over all of this. And then how will this affect, in the end, U.S. immigration policy, U.S. immigration positions? I think Sabrina and David have hit it just right. I don't see, regardless of what happens, peace or no peace, I think we're going to see a very, very strong constriction. And I think we do have to look at Project 2025, which discusses at considerable length refugee and asylum issues. And I think it's safe to say Ukrainian and Russian asylum seekers were not in the focus of this report. I mean, of course, it's much more focused on immigration coming from Latin America and Africa than it is from Europe. Nevertheless, it seems quite reasonable in reviewing it that things like TPS designations will be revoked or will not be extended.
The Fulbright Scholars question, right, for people that were being sponsored by organizations that have now been deemed undesirable, right, in Russia. I mean, in my view, like that's enough right there to file an asylum claim. I mean, obviously, individual vetting important, right? Somebody's own immigration and criminal history can be incredibly determinative about asylum, but I would think right now there would be a great deal of sympathy and a great deal of good legal arguments that anybody who ever was sponsored by, worked for, affiliated with, gave speeches, gave presentations to an organization that is now essentially on an undesirables list in Russia is in serious risk of harm on an imputed political opinion ground. Here's the other thing I will say. Outside of the detention context, right? Because obviously things move much, much faster in detention. There is a very high likelihood that anybody who is seeking asylum and doesn't have a merits hearing yet scheduled or is waiting in an affirmative asylum backlog is not going to reach a determination on asylum eligibility before the end of the Trump years. That is the one uplifting thing I can actually say. I have a great deal of asylum cases that I took representation on during the Obama years. And then, of course, Trump gets elected and everything looks like it's going to hell for asylum. And I lost precisely 0 of them to the Trump years because none of them got hearings, right? The court backlog is so extreme. And as you mentioned, Dimitri, has only gotten worse in the last 4 years that none of them got to hearings. And the same thing with the asylum backlog. So here in Los Angeles, we recently got a statistic that there are over 100,000 affirmative asylum cases pending at the Los Angeles Asylum Office. They are scheduling approximately 2,000 of them per year for interview. So I'm not a great mathematician. That's why I became a lawyer. But my bad math skills tell me that means you wait 50 years for an asylum interview in Los Angeles now. On the assumption that Donald Trump does not successfully overthrow the US Constitution, which if he does, we all have a lot of other problems that we can't consider on today's roundtable. None of the cases being filed today will ever see the light of day during Donald Trump's administration unless they begin pulling them out of order, which is always possible, but I don't think is super likely. I love this question though, Julia, thank you, because I do a lot of federal litigation that you just put in. I file a ton of mandamus claims. It's part of my bread and butter favorites. So the question about how do officers react to requests for expedited case processing when the reason for filing the mandamus is a long wait. I don't think there is a direct correlation between filing a mandamus and an officer being harder on you at the asylum office. I have seen people file mandamus claims, go to interview, have a hard officer, have an easy officer, have an in-between officer. I think there is probably a much higher correlation between what are the entrenched nationality biases, right? My firm's perspective on this, quite frankly, is that people from African countries face entrenched biases at the asylum office, regardless of how, the course of processing, whether they file an asylum, a mandamus case or not. And I think that's, so I don't think those that file are any worse off than those that don't file in the end. I think if there is going to be a disadvantage, it's going to be much more about where the claim is arising from than whether or not they filed a lawsuit. Now, I do think the big thing to consider with mandamuses is what is a long time in the immigration world, right? As we just said, currently, apparently it takes 50 years to get an interview for asylum. Now, obviously, that is patently unreasonable for everyone. But I do get people who come to me who filed 3-4 years ago. And while I understand why that feels like an eternity to wait for a determination on your asylum application, I think in most jurisdictions, if the Department of Justice opposes your mandamus and forces it to summary judgment, you will lose on a 4-year wait. It is not long enough in the immigration world right now to become unreasonable, as sad as that sounds. And unless there is some very specific, hardship to that person that really merits that kind of, quite frankly, line jumping, because it is line jumping at that point to force an interview on those cases. And that may be the case for some folks, right? There may be family members trapped abroad, for example. I think that's a particularly notable circumstance if there are minor children or spouses who would benefit from an I-730 filed on their behalf if their spouse or parent in the US gets asylum that may be in danger in home countries. And that is something to raise with the asylum office directly, with a mandamus, if that's the course you go. But absent that kind of circumstance, I think you're starting to look at a time where 8-9 years is really the sort of unreasonable wait times from a federal court perspective. And even then, there's no guarantees that the federal court will see it that way. About the leaking of a potential elimination of social group grounds, first of all, particular social group is written into the asylum statute. This would require an act of Congress to actually eliminate that ground for asylum. Now, Trump will have both the House and the Senate. It is conceivably possible they can shove something terrible through. I haven't heard any real whisperings that this seems to be their priority target for, sort of negative immigration reform. What I do think we will see, though, and that we definitely saw during the first Trump administration, is agency decisions, right? Attorney General decisions through the Board of Immigration Appeals and through the Attorney General's office himself, narrowing what a particular social group means, right? And how you prove eligibility under that ground. And what we saw that in particular with gender violence cases, domestic violence type of claims during the Trump 1 administration. And what the shift was that practitioners very rightly, if I may say, began to frame those as a matter of political opinion, feminist political opinion. I think you will very likely see, if we need to, a very similar shift to framing LGBTQ claims as a form of actual or imputed political opinions by their home governments. And that will be a way to try to get around whatever narrowing of the social groups interpretations come out.
I think we had a very substantial conversation here. I think everybody sees that you'll be extremely fortunate to be a Sabrina or David's clients on immigration, or Scott's on other issues. We are at the point when we are really facing serious perils for the safety of a number of groups in our society, and that's a matter of fact. And these groups, some are large, some are small, like ours, but these threats are interconnected, in my humble opinion. The threats to immigrant rights are connected to threats to other groups, LGBT, women's rights, and others that we see from the rhetoric coming from the next administration. And I would say that what worries me, that some of our institutions, that, as I'm observing it, are already performing what historian Timothy Snyder has called kind of anticipatory obedience, kind of folding in. And we all understand, we here in the US, we learned some of this American pragmatism that tells us if you can't beat them, then you should join them. But I think that our communities should better be prepared to stand with those among us who are likely to or may be harmed. And we better have a strong, competent lawyers like we had here today at a round table that are familiar with our community. And I think fear is not the answer here. Those of us who came to the US to live under the rule of law, we don't want to live here by the Kremlin playbook here in the United States. And I think it's will be time to use the power of the law that we have in the United States to defend anyone who may be unjustly harmed. So many thanks to all of our speakers, and I hope we'll stay in touch with Sabrina and Scott and David, and perhaps connect about specific cases if you don't mind. And thank you for all participants, and happy International Migrant Day, which is coming in 2 days, and most of all, happy and safe and dignified holidays and New Year to all.
Thank you so much, Dmitry.
Goodbye.
Happy holidays,
Bye-bye.
everyone.